Prewrathers distinguish between the Great Tribulation, cut short, and the Day of the Lord, thereby interpreting Daniel's 7th week as interrupted by the rapture. So Satan has his way for a little while, but then God steps in and says, enough is enough. You're not going to have your way anymore. You're not going to be able to just declare yourself as God. I'm going to cut short your tribulation program. I'm going to let you hang around on the scene until the end of the week, because that's what Daniel prophesied would happen, that the Antichrist would have 42 months, 3.5 years, a time times and half a time. That is the time allotted to the Antichrist, and God doesn't take that away from him. But what God does cut short, per what Jesus gave us in Matthew, is the fact that if not for those days being cut short, the elect would not be saved. But in excuse me, in Mark's version, it's either Mark or Luke, I get those two confused sometimes, of the Olivet Discourse, Yeshua says that no flesh would be saved, not just the elect, but the intense hatred that Antichrist will have, not just for Jews and Christians or anyone who doesn't take his mark, or anyone he decides to persecute. I mean, we know that primarily, according to a very surface level reading of the Bible, Jews and Christians will be the target of his persecution. In numerous places across both Old Testament and New Testament chapters, we find indications that he's going after Israel, he's going after Israel's offspring, he's going after those who hold to the commandments and testimony of Jesus, he's going after Jews, he's going after Christians, he's going to go after anyone who doesn't take the mark. But it seems to be that if Satan can really just wipe out all of humanity, then God will have no kingdom to build. Jesus will have no inheritance to get from his Father. The program of God will fail if Satan can just basically destroy God's creation, meaning humans, those who are created as imagers in the image of God. That seems to be Satan's great plan. I mean, remember, the Bible describes him as someone who's come to kill and to steal and to destroy. He's like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. He's not out to simply hurt us, is what I'm trying to say. When I say us, I mean Jews and Christians. He's out to take our lives. But I get the impression from reading other passages, the overall view of the Bible, that if Satan could actually just wipe out all of humanity, because he knows he's a spirit creature and he can't be harmed by something like a nuclear bomb or something. But if he can wipe out human life from all of planet Earth and just extinguish human life, then he believes that he will have defeated God's program. So Satan will have his way for a while, but God's going to step in and interrupt that program. So like I said in this photo here, or in this when we keep moving, mid-trib, post-trib, when we get to the pre-wrath, it is in this part where the Great Tribulation is kind of marching along, and then the rapture comes and interrupts the Great Tribulation we don't know when, but we just know it will interrupt it, and that will initiate the Day of the Lord afterwards. So the rapture is that part there in the middle that separates the tribulation of Satan from the wrath of God. And pre-wrathers make this distinction, but post-tribbers don't seem to need that distinction between wrath of Satan and wrath of God, since everything happens at the very end of the week. Matthew 24:22 is the verse that talks about the cutting short here. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. Daniel's 9:27 says the final week is divided into two halves. This is one of the ways in which to understand the division in the week, even though Daniel doesn't describe, how do we say this? There's some details that are left out as far as how we know that there's a final 7-year period at all. It's because part of what Daniel talks about is that at the midpoint of the week, there will be this activity. And so he says the week, the Shavua in the Hebrew. Classic Prewrathers then interpret Jesus' statement about days being cut short as referring to a rapture before God's wrath. Okay? Post-trib does not allow for this interruption and tends to see the 70th week as a solid, unbroken block ending at the second coming. So, again, in their model, they don't need... Let me show it to you again. So, in the pre-wrath model, right, we have this separation of tribulation Sorry, didn't mean to move that around. This separation of tribulation and day of the Lord, but in the post-trib version, we don't need that hard separation between great tribulation and God's wrath. I mean, at least on this chart, it looks like there's some overlap or some combination of the two. Please remember that I could be wrong, right? The post-tribbers could have it right. I could be wrong here. The main point I want to emphasize is that affirming that Jesus is returning, and that if you know him as Lord and Savior, then you're going to be included in his kingdom. Get your priorities straight and make sure that you're focusing on that aspect first. Get your relationship with God in order first and foremost. Make sure that you know the Lord. Make sure that you're following his ways. Make sure that you're counted among the righteous. Make sure you've got fruit in your life. Make sure that you know that you know that you know that you know, right? That's why I emphasize not just salvation, but the fruit as well. Because when the time of trouble comes, when God's wrath is poured out, when the great tribulation comes, if I'm wrong as far as being pre-wrath, and it goes down the way pre-tribbers say, then we're going to have to go through quite a bit more than what I was anticipating, right? And so you always want to be prepared either way. So going back to my study here, I've got just a short quote from Van Kampen. God will cut short the persecution of the elect by removing them. This interrupts the second half of the week before the wrath begins. That's from his book, The Sign, which I have sitting on my shelf back here. All right, let's keep going. I've got 20 minutes left, and I do plan on finishing most of this. Point number 5, where I, as a pre-wrather, have some disagreements with post-tribbers. And these disagreements, by the way, are not my own. They are also shared by other pre-wrathers. Is that post-trib can't account for the timing structure of the book of Revelation. And this is a biggie, so I saved it for last. This is probably one of the places where historicists and futurists really pull apart from one another. Post-tribbers and pre-wrathers can't agree on this. The timing structure of the book of Revelation. I wish I had more time at this moment to go into a deep dive of the book of Revelation, but I'm saving that for, if you remember my eschatological schedule, we're going to get into the book of Revelation when we get to topic 15 and 16. That's book of Revelation. But for now, we're still just kind of hinting at some of these differences. But let's read down through this and see if any of it makes sense to you. Pre-wrathers insist that the book of Revelation is progressive, not cyclic. Okay, let me pause. Progressive meaning it goes forward in a way in which it builds on the account earlier, the account later builds on the account that were earlier. So it reads the way you would normally read a book if you were just reading it in prose fashion, narrative fashion. There are themes that are carried along that seem to be best carried along as you read it in a linear fashion from left to right, from start to finish. Excuse me. And that's what I mean by progressive. It's similar to the way the entire Bible itself reads. If you start with the Tanakh and work your way towards the apostolic scriptures, you build a foundation of this portfolio of who the Messiah is and who God's people are and the plans of God that begin to come to a fullness once you actually reach the apostolic scriptures and start reading about that Messiah whose name is Jesus and the people of God, which includes both Jews and Gentiles. And then you come to a conclusion with the book of Revelation where God finally brings his son's kingdom to planet Earth and establishes it in the millennial time period. But you only get that view properly if you start from the book of Genesis and work your way toward the book of Revelation. I believe that Revelation was written in that way. John wrote it, I believe, that way. And I believe the visions were given to him that way, right? There's in this whole giant Revelation vision that we know as the book of Revelation, it's broken down, I think, into 4 or 5 separate revelations that are kind of marked out by John saying, and after these things, blah, blah, blah. And then he talks for about 3 chapters or so. And then he says, and after these things, blah, blah, blah. So we can kind of see that there's this progressive nature to it. And as opposed to being what we call cyclic. So cyclic would be, let me show this one to you. Give me a moment, I'm pulling up a different chart. Cyclic, especially when we get to the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. Let me find my little chart. I'm looking at my iPad sitting off to the side of me. All right, maybe I can jump over here and see this. Here's one version of the seals, trumpets, and bowls, but this is put together in a way that I believe actually is the way they work. Seals 1 through 6 happen, and then we kind of build to seal number 7, which then turns around and builds up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and culminates in number 7 trumpets, which builds to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bowls. So that's the way that I follow along. There's a logical linear progression of 1 through 7 in the numbers, building up to this crescendo of number 7 in one of the sets, which is the seals, which then unleashes the next series of trumpets 1 through 6, which builds up and culminates in number 7, which starts the whole thing all over again as far as numbering. But in this version, seals, trumpets, and bowls are not actually overlapping with one another. So seal 1 is not trumpet 1, is not bowl 1. Neither is seal 7 equal to trumpet 7, which would be equal to bowl 7. So I don't see them as overlapping and on top of one another. That's what I mean by, or I don't see a cycling of where the story that God told in seal 1 through 7 is the same story that he told in trumpet 1 through 7, which is the same story that he told in bowl 1 through 7. In other words, when you read through the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you absolutely do get a cycle where Matthew tells the story of Jesus from start to finish, and then Mark does the same thing. He starts at the beginning of Jesus' life and works his way down to the death of Jesus. Luke does the same, starts at the beginning, works his way to the end. And then John does some similar things, although we don't get all the same details, but the general cycle is present, where we start at the beginning of Jesus' life and ministry, birth in some cases, and work our way through his ministry chronologically, culminating in his crucifixion and then the eventual resurrection. And so with the Gospels, we do have a cycle. We have 4 different accounts that are giving us the same story over and over again. We realize that the proper way to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is to actually lay them all on top of one another and treat them as one chronological story, although from 4 different perspectives with some slightly different details here and there. But it's really the life of Jesus once. It's not that Jesus lived 4 times and 4 different authors wrote about 4 different Jesuses. I mean, that's nonsense, right? Well, when we get to the book of Revelation, we absolutely can see the seals, trumpets, and bowls as having themes that overlap. What happens in seal 1 has some similar themes with what happens in trumpet 1 and bowl 1. And certainly at seal 7, trumpet 7, and bowl 7, we have some themes that are shared across the 3 types of pictures here, the 3 type of instruments or representations of whatever God is doing. However, it's not necessary to see the seals, trumpets, and bowls as the same as the Gospels that I mentioned earlier, as one event told 3 different ways. It's not necessary to do that. I'm not saying that you can't do that. There are authors who do it, and I'm telling you that this is something that I believe pre-tribbers seem to find some comfort in doing or preference in doing in suiting their understanding of the book of Revelation. Historicists don't seem to have a problem doing it this way. I'm telling you that as a pre-wrather, it doesn't seem to work out that way. It's best seen that the seals, the trumpets, and bowls are 3 separate things. They're not like the Gospels. They are 3 separate sequences of occurrences, things that happen on planet Earth, with there's some thematic overlap, but otherwise the seals are not the trumpets are not the bowls are not the seals. They are not the same thing. That's my point. All right, so Prewrathers insist that the book of Revelation is progressive, not cyclic, not cycling, not just recycling the same 7 events but told a different way. Posttrib often adopts recapitulation, seals, trumpets, bowls, all describing the same events. All right, let's read a little bit. Revelation 8, 1-2, quote, "When the Lamb broke the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven. Then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them." And so I take a very face value reading of the book of Revelation as a Prewrather. And so when John writes that the seventh seal was broken and then 7 trumpets were given to the 7 angels, this to me reads very natural, sequential, that the 7th seal initiates the 7 trumpets, and then we start enumerating the 7 trumpets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. And then when we get to the 7th trumpet, we have the same, kind of a similar pattern where the 7th trumpet initiates the 7 bowls, and then they play out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's the way I read the book of Revelation. Let's pick up some bullet points. The 7th seal releases the trumpets. Clear chronological flow, as far as I can tell. Again, when I get to heaven, if I'm wrong, when I get to heaven, and John tells me, Ariel, you read the seals, trumpets, and bowls as sequential, chronological, progressive. But I didn't mean them that way. I meant them to be cyclical, overlapping, just a repetition, a recapitulation of the same things over and over. Ariel, why did you read it the wrong way? What's your answer? I'm going to say to him, I just took it literally. If you told me what it was saying and you used chronological language that made sense in the original language and made sense in my receptor language, which is English, then that's where I'm at fault. Okay, so you got to fault me there. Revelation 15:1, in them the bowl judgments, the wrath of God is finished, showing sequential escalation of wrath, not repetition. So there are these little clues that John's giving that seem to indicate that the flow is meant to be interpreted in a very sequential manner, or a kind of a build-up based on this theme of starting small and working our way towards the build-up. So again, don't misunderstand me. There is thematic overlap between seals, trumpets, and bowls. There is also this crescendoing effect where God starts on the low end of the punishments or the damage that's happening to whoever's receiving it, and working his way up and building up to this climax when we go from 1 to 7. Even in the numbering, we have that concept going on, right? 2 is greater than 1, 3 is greater than 2, 4 is greater than 3, etc., until we get to 7. 7 is greater than 6, which is also greater than 1. So even in the numbering system, we see that there's a buildup of this anticipation of something is happening sequentially. And when we read about the details, we also are left with that sense of whatever happens in the 7th, which is a theme that's carried along throughout the Bible. Whatever happens in the 7th of a set of 7 things seems to be either the fullness of what God is trying to convey, or the climax of where God is driving, or in his sequence of things, it seems to be the pinnacle of whatever God is communicating in whatever set of 7 seems to exist, right? There are many different 7s all throughout the Bible. You guys know what I'm talking about there. Let's continue. Posttrib struggles to maintain a natural, linear progression through the book of Revelation. Again, if I meet John one day, he's going to be like, Ariel, why did you misunderstand my book? In other words, I'm assuming that, let's say, the post-tribbers are right and the pre-wrathers got it wrong. I'm just going to tell him, I read the words. They seemed like they were going in the direction. You left some clues. It looked like that's what you're trying to get to me. I'm sorry, I just read it at face value. All right, Charles Cooper has this quote here. The pre-wrath position maintains a consistent sequential understanding of Revelation's narrative, unlike post-trib, which relies on recapitulation. Now, eventually we're going to get into the book of Revelation. And what you are going to find is that there are certain times in the narrative where, for instance, I'll just pick on one. When we get to chapter 8 of Revelation, we suddenly start reading about the trumpets. They start pouring out. Through Revelation chapter 8 and chapter 9 are these trumpet judgments. But then suddenly, when we get to chapter 10, 11, and 12, there's this kind of this interruption in the narrative that is John giving us a kind of a zoom out, what some authors like to call the 30,000-foot view. They like to zoom out and look at the bigger picture so that the readers can kind of still follow along at where we're at on the timetable of God's 70th week. John zooms out and in 10, 11, and 12 before zooming back in 13 and starting to deal with the beast system of the Antichrist. And then we start talking about him for 13, 14, 15, talking about the Antichrist and his program and some of those activities. There's another zoom out in chapter 14. But then when we get to 16, we zoom back in at the bowls and start dealing with those the final wrath of God. And so the point is, if John was meant for the book of Revelation to be just read from start to finish without any interruption, then chapter 9 should be followed by chapter 16 as far as trumpets moving directly into bowls. If you want to see this, by the way, I think I'll just show it to you real quick. I've got the time. So let's jump over to Revelation and let me jump to chapter 8. Well, I'm sorry, let me back up to chapter 6. So in chapter 6, we have the first seal. Then I saw the Lamb broke one of the 7 seals, meaning it's the very first seal. And we know it's the first one because in verse 3 it says when he broke the second seal. Okay, so your Bible headings are helping you out here this time. First seal, conqueror on a white horse, First seal, right. So Revelation 6 is seals 1 through, when I scroll down to the bottom, we dead end with the sixth seal in verse 12. That's Revelation 6. So we have to jump to Revelation 7 to find the continuation of the story. But he doesn't say when he broke the seventh seal in Revelation chapter 7. If I were the translators, I would have actually included all of chapter 7 as part of chapter 6, because that's the narrative continues without introducing seal number 7 just yet. Indeed, in verse 1 of chapter 7, he just starts talking about the sealing of the 144,000. When he gets to verse 9, he talks about this great multitude, and then the chapter ends. And there's no seventh seal mentioned. So when we get to Revelation chapter 8, that's when verse 1 says, when the Lamb broke the seventh seal. So we know there's sequence, but notice we went from 6, 7, and 8 with this slight interruption in chapter 7 to introduce these two groups of people, the 144,000 and the multitude. So it's not till we get to chapter 8 that we finally start reading about he broke the seventh seal, there's silence in heaven, and then 7 trumpets were given to 7 angels. So that's where we have the overlap between the seventh seal and the introduction of the 7 trumpets. So at that point in time, we know that we're going to start reading about transitioning from seals to trumpets because we start talking about trumpets. And indeed, when we get to verse 7, the first trumpet sounds. So we're in chapter 8 of Revelation, but now we're talking about the first trumpet. So we're not in first seal anymore. We're in first trumpet mode. And so from Revelation 8 through the end of the chapter, we only make it through the 4th trumpet, as in verse 12, the 4th angel sounded. So we have to keep reading. We get to chapter 9, and verse 1 says, the 5th angel sounded. So we're now still in trumpet 5, but we're in Revelation chapter 9. So the trumpets are going through, they're spanning the entirety of chapter 8, and now we're in chapter 9. We know there's 7 of them, so we would hope to read through about all 7 through the end of chapter 9. We read down through, and we get to the 6th trumpet in verse 13, but notice it doesn't finish talking about the trumpets in chapter 9. So we jump over to chapter 10 and we're like, okay, where's the 7th trumpet? But it's missing. It's not there in chapter 10. He's talking about this little angel, or this strong angel. It's got a rainbow over his head, takes another small book, small scroll. Like, where's the 7th trumpet? It's not in Revelation 10 where we would guess it to be. Let's keep going. Is it in Revelation 11? We read down through Revelation 11. The word trumpet's not there either. At least we don't see it there. Do you see it? I don't see it. There it is. We scroll down and we find it. I'm speaking to you like your little kids, right? Finally, in Revelation chapter 11, the 7th angel sounds. But we're like, does that mean that everything in front of that took place between the 6th and 7th trumpet? Not quite. There's some recapitulation there. Some zoom out. Let's look at the beginning of the week. Let's look at what the two witnesses have to do. In fact, the 2 witnesses back us up to the midpoint of the week, because John starts talking about this 1,260 days, 42 months, times and half the time again. And so that kind of starts to fill in some of the sequencing. But remember, we're only at trumpet 7 at this point, but we're in Revelation 11. We're like, well, if the trumpets are the end of the 70th week, boy, we're only in the middle of the book of Revelation, right? Remember, there's 22 chapters, but we're only at 11. What happens with 12 through 22? So the 7th trumpet is in Revelation 11, but now we know that the bowls are going to come next. But instead of introducing the bowls right here at Revelation 11, because we just finished chapter 7, like the seals did, instead, when we get to chapter 12, now we have this big overview kind of concept of this woman of Israel and the dragon, and it talks about that times and half a time again. Kind of a unique story. Revelation 13 talks about the beast from the sea, the dragon. So we start talking about the beast, right? The two beasts, actually. And then Revelation 14 has another story about the 144,000 on Mount Zion. Some overview language of the harvest of righteous and unrighteous, and some language like that. And we're like, where in the world are the bowls? When are we going to read about the bowls? But finally, okay, so we're into chapter 15 now. We're still not seeing any bowls. We just have all these other extra details that's kind of either interrupting or interluding or recapitulating, but we still don't have our bowls. We need our sequence. Like, where are our bowls? We're reading all these details, but no bowls. But finally, when we get to chapter 16, then I heard a loud voice from heaven saying to the 7 angels, go and pour out on the earth the 7 bowls of the wrath of God. Finally, we have our bowls, right? But we're all the way in chapter 16, right? We stopped reading about the trumpets way back over in, do you remember where it was? It was chapter 11. The 7th trumpet was way over there. And even then we had this break between chapter 9 and chapter 11 from the 6th trumpet to the 7th trumpet. So now finally in Revelation 16, we pick up the bowls. And so we got the first bowl in verse 2, the second bowl in verse 3, the third bowl in verse 4, the fourth bowl in verse 8, the fifth bowl in verse 10. Wow, looks like it's going really quick. The sixth bowl, in verse 12, and then the 7th bowl in verse 17. So we get all 7 bowls in Revelation 16. We're like, finally, wow. And then we can finally move to 17 and we read about the Mystery Babylon. Chapter 18, we get more Mystery Babylon, 2 chapters given over to Mystery Babylon. And then finally in 19, we get the Marriage Supper of the Lamb and the Battle of Armageddon. And the Antichrist and the false prophet get seized and thrown into alive into the lake of fire. And since I'm keep going with my overview, I guess chapter 20 is Satan is bound, the introduction of the 1,000 years, which goes by really quick. Satan is prisoned for 1,000 years, then he's let loose at the end of 1,000 years, and there's another battle, kind of like Armageddon 2.0 or Gog and Magog, final conclusion. However you want to describe that there. Judgment, throne of God, the great white throne judgment in Revelation 20. And then finally we start reading about the new heaven and the new earth. New Jerusalem comes down in chapter 21. And then the final chapter describing the new, the eternal state, living in New Jerusalem in the eternal state. And the final message to John. And then the book is done. Roll the credits, right? Okay, so my whole point in going through that kind of overview was that when we look at the book of Revelation, it is not just only a sequence going from start to finish. There's some interruptions, there's some what I like to call interludes, and there's some retelling, some recapitulation. But overall, the structure is still maintained by keeping a consistent sequential understanding that best supports the times when there is interruption to the narrative. We still know in the back of our mind that we read 6 trumpets, but we're waiting for the 7th trumpet. That's what I mean by this sequence. If we stopped at a 6th trumpet and then we're in a new chapter and there's no mention of a 7th trumpet, we know that sooner or later John has to describe the 7th trumpet because he mentioned 7 earlier. So we know that there's this. It's gonna happen somewhere. We just need to kind of be patiently wait for it. So that's why I think Cooper's comment is very appropriate. the Prewrath position maintains a consistent sequential understanding of Revelation's narrative, unlike Posttrib, which relies on recapitulation. All right, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here. Remember, I've got that excursus that I said. If you put in your comments that Ariel, can you please read the excursus? I want you to do it. I'm going to stop here because next week I have this little summary table that I want to use. I want to take a little bit of time to go back and just hit some of those points. I'm not going to do it today, but we'll do it next week. But consider my admonition to, like I said earlier, take your own position. Read about someone else's position. These days, Google's pretty easy in summarizing things. Use an AI assistant if you need, ChatGPT or Copilot or Google's Gemini or Perplexity or a Claude AI, or pick your AI of choice. What is Musk's one? Starts with an R. I can't remember. Roku or something like that. Pick whatever AI you want. I prefer to use ChatGPT. And tell it, ask ChatGPT, give me a summary of all the different positions, their main points, and compare them to one another, and help me to see kind of a bigger picture. And let your research assistant do some of the work for you. You'd be amazed what the results will bring back. But that'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events.